Welcome to episode 46 of Tahrir Podcast. It is the 8th of March 2025, and my guest today is John Lechner. John is a writer and researcher. His most recent book, Death is Our Business, Russian Mercenaries in the New Era of Private Warfare, published by Bloomsbury Publishing a couple days ago, is a groundbreaking investigation into the Wagner Group and its impact on global conflict. John has spent years tracking Wagner's operations across Ukraine, Syria, and Africa, conducting exclusive interviews with members, veterans, and victims. His reporting has been featured in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and Foreign Policy, among others. With his deep knowledge of Russian private military networks and their geopolitical significance, he offers a rare and vital perspective on the future of warfare. Today, we'll dive into Wagner's origins, its rise as a key tool of Russian power projection, and what its legacy means for conflicts to come. We'll also discuss Yevgeny Prigozhin, his rebellion, his fall, and the ways his vision for mercenary warfare is still shaping the battlefield. This episode is supported by the Arab Political Science Network. Welcome to Tahrir Podcast, John. It's great to finally have you on.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Of course, welcome. And so, before we jump into it, and before I ask you about Wagner's current status, how did the idea of the book come about in the first place?
Yeah, I think as you maybe gathered a little bit in the book, my primary passion in life is happens to be languages, linguistics, and language learning. And so much of what I do and travel and it's all a vehicle for me, an excuse for me to try and learn as many languages as possible. And so that's sort of kind of naturally always what draws me. I had spent some time living in Russia before college and had spent some good time there after. I speak Russian fluently, and I was a Russian studies guy in college, and then like a lot of people who have, very niche or, creative passions, I went into investment banking and worked on Wall Street for 7 years and quickly, well, not even quickly, I guess, it took me 7 years to finally admit to myself that that finance wasn't my passion, and I wasn't going to be able to kind of square that with learning Chechen and, all of these kind of small, interesting languages. And so I moved down to DC. I started doing some work at a think tank, and I had been spending more time traveling through Africa as well. And so after, I think it was right before I ended up going to grad school and right before COVID broke out, I had been reading about how these Russian contractors had been touching down in the Central African Republic starting in 2018. And this to me initially was, I loved Africa. I spent so much time in Russia studying Russian. And so I felt that, I wanted to be the person who was there to see how these two very disparate societies were interacting with each other, adapting or not adapting to each other's presence. And so I first arrived in Central African Republic in 2019 and became fascinated with the country itself. I wanted to learn as much as I could there about the politics, the governance, how things work. And I just began becoming somehow a writer and a freelance journalist covering the conflict. And then eventually, as I felt that I had gotten to know the country itself and traveled around it, and met many of the important political actors, I started meeting with Wagner as well, and getting their perspective on the conflict, and this sort of morphed into the idea that this is certainly a book, and then it just kind of it took off from there.
And before I jump to the question that I alluded to earlier, how did Wagner start in the first place?
Yeah. So there's a couple different things I think that are important, and I think um, that the book highlights, and one is that Wagner probably, I mean, almost certainly would not have existed as it exists now were it not for Yevgeny Prigozhin, its founder, who is a tightly packed ball of ambition and constantly looking to get his guys into places to make more. He's very much motivated by like the transaction itself, get like the deal. He himself comes from the wrong side of the tracks. He is a petty thief, kind of a street thug, part of a gang in St. Petersburg, which was then Leningrad in the Soviet Union. He goes away to prison, comes back 8 or 9 years later. The Soviet Union has fallen. Leningrad is now St. Petersburg, and he works his way up. First working with some gangsters, and then works his way up to becoming a restaurateur with some very fancy restaurants that cater to the Russian elite. And from there, he meets Putin, he meets other Russian elite, and he works his way up to contracts of providing meals to the Russian military and the Russian schools. And this is a very lucrative business to be in the political economy of Russia. You want to have access to the state budget because that gives you a chance to steal from the state budget, right? And so, but he's always operating in this environment where he constantly has to prove himself. And Russia itself is a country now getting back on its feet from the very chaotic 1990s. Putin has great ambitions to restore Russia as what they would call kind of a great power status, but their means are still relatively limited, right? And so, and resources too. And so, in these circumstances, this provides opportunities for kind of oligarchs like Yevgeny Prigozhin to fill the gaps, right? Or to go out and kind of start these patriotic initiatives that they can frame as furthering the interests of the Kremlin, of the Russian state. And it's a form of, it's a different form of virtue signaling in a way, in the same way that a rich businessman might donate to a political party, right? He or she might not recuperate those direct costs, right? But it's kind of like think of me when the next, contract comes along for such and such. And a lot of, I mean, all societies work this way in kind of different versions of it. But so Prigozhin has kind of put himself into this lucrative position. He certainly wants to maintain it. He always wants to rise higher. And in starting in 2013, there's at the end of 2013, a revolution is brewing in Ukraine. The incumbent government of Yanukovych reneges on a deal to become closer with the European Union and opts for going in Russia's direction. And people across Ukraine are rising up in what becomes the Maidan Revolution. The Kremlin decides, and Putin himself and his inner circle of advisors make the decision that they're going to annex Crimea, the peninsula on the Black Sea. This is where the Black Sea Fleet is stationed. It's Russia's only warm water port. It's important. Also, it has a lot of cultural resonance for Russians as a vacation destination, as sort of all of these romantic visions, and the belief that it was unfairly given over to Ukraine. And so in early 2014, the top-down decision is made. annex Crimea. There's a special operation involving Russian special forces, and they take they take Crimea, the peninsula, in almost a bloodless operation to kind of provide a degree of extra manpower and the guise of sort of this being a very kind of local movement. The state also kind of allows in or even sometimes buses in these sort of nationalist volunteers from Russia itself to Crimea. And so all of these kind of far right, these Cossacks and various other Russian nationalists are showing up there to provide, security, quote unquote, to, help ensure a fair referendum in their mind, quote unquote. and everything goes according to plan. The referendum is held. Crimea votes for to be annexed, and Russia agrees. And at this point, the Kremlin is pretty much thinking that, okay, this is done and dusted. But again, in Ukraine, more broadly, you're still in this revolutionary environment, and as pro-Maidan, the kind of the pro-revolution activists and protesters are taking over administrative buildings in Russia's east, in the coal-producing region of Donbass. Anti-Maidan protesters and activists are taking over administrative buildings, and these people are not necessarily like pro-Russian at this point. It's sort of the old regime's sort of constituency in a way, and they have a lot of economic ties with Russia. Again, it's a lot of people work in the coal mines. The coal goes to Russia, right? And so there's also a fear that that in going closer to the EU, that these folks are going to be out of a job. And after the annexation in Crimea, there's some secondary effects that the Kremlin isn't thinking about, which is namely that these activists in eastern Ukraine now want the Russian state to come in and support them against the pro-Maidan forces. And this puts Putin himself into a bit of a bind, because they didn't want to annex more territory at the time, but Putin is just coming off of destabilizing protests against his own return to the presidency in 2012, and among the protesters are a lot of far right and Russian nationalists, and the annexation of Crimea had sort of boosted his nationalist credentials back home with these folks, and leaving the pro-Russian, as they're kind of becoming, or anti-Maidan, Russians kind of abandoning them in eastern Ukraine is not a good look anymore among the Russian public. But they don't want more sanctions. They don't want more international isolation. And so the Kremlin turns to sort of these ad hoc measures to both not support and support the separatists against kind of a growing Ukrainian what they call the counterterrorism operation to retake these territories from separatists. And so they start letting volunteers through, these same volunteers who were in Crimea previously, and they have to turn towards, these kind of like, mercenaries, as they would call it. But really, I mean, it's kind of set up by the Russian military too. But this is an opportunity as well for enterprising, politically astute oligarchs like Yevgeny Prigozhin to come in and sponsor these things as a way to show, hey, look at me, I'm really helping out down here, right? And so Yevgeny Prigozhin connects with a former commander in Russian intelligence, GRU, Dmitry Utkin, and Utkin provides the mercenaries, and Prigozhin provides the funds and the political cover.
Yeah, there's a lot we'll be unpacking here today. And so to kind of provide this general overframe, so where does Wagner stand today following Prigozhin's death?
Yeah. Well, I think the just to tie uh those kind of two things together, when Wagner went into eastern Ukraine in 2014 and was there in 2015, no one expected it to become what it became. It was kind of supposed to be a short-term solution to a problem that the Kremlin had, right? And Yevgeny Prigozhin, as someone who is, certainly kind of an entrepreneur and someone who is constantly looking to, expand into all sorts of businesses, takes it takes this Wagner group and then lobbies to get them into Syria, and then has his guys go out and find new opportunities in Africa, and the business kind of keeps growing and growing. Uh, in in 2022, after initially not being allowed to be in there, he gets his men into the full scale invasion of Ukraine, and then they become absolutely kind of enormous. They're recruiting prisoners, up to 50,000 prisoners. Prigozhin is promising to take the city of Bakhmut from the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians decide to defend it, and so Prigozhin uses human wave tactics with the convicts to take the city, and ultimately he comes into conflict with the Ministry of Defense and the Minister of Defense in particular, and he mutinies. He calls off the mutiny, which ultimately kind of results in his demise 3 months later when his plane falls out of the sky, and now Wagner Group is present, or at the time of Prigozhin's death, they had a presence in Syria. They had a presence, a very light presence because of the civil war in Sudan, but maybe a few guys in Sudan. They had a lot of operations in the Central African Republic. They had operations in Mali and Libya. And how those operations were handed over in a way sort of reflects as well the relationship between the Russian state and Wagner, more specifically the Ministry of Defense and Wagner in each of these theaters where they were operating, and also the importance of these theaters for the Kremlin, right? And so in Syria, there were some difficulties in trying to hand over the assets themselves because the Russians were worried that if there was a change in ownership, the Assad regime would try to renationalize everything. And so they had to be very delicate about how they were going about it. I mean, Syria is a very complicated place to be working, obviously, for anybody, including the Russians. And in Sudan, there wasn't that much to hand over anymore. In Libya, as you know, there wasn't an ongoing conflict at that time. There's a ceasefire from October 2020 that resulted in sort of a stalemate between the Tripoli militias, backed by Turkey, and Haftar, backed by the UAE and Russia. And so the Ministry of Defense shows up, and they basically just have to ask people to re-sign contracts. There's not a lot of movement to be done. Mali and the Central African Republic are two much more difficult situations. In the latter, the Ministry of Defense shows up, and they see that Wagner is, running a counterinsurgency. They offer political advisory. They're in gold mining. They own breweries for beer. They have a vodka distillery. They're in timber. And these guys are just like normal military officers. And so they look at it and they're like, what the hell are we supposed to do with this, right? Like, and it's not really important enough to the Kremlin, right? That, and so the decision is made, well, if it's not broke, like, let's not fix it. And so they kind of let the same people run it because they're the only ones who know what it is actually going on. And things don't change too much. And the reason that they were expanding into all of those different businesses and such is, I mean, two factors. One, that they were able to eventually sort of understand how to operate in the Central African Republic and Central African society and politics, but also there weren't competing Russians who were there who would provide like a natural check to Prigozhin's activities. There really wasn't other Russian security institutions. There really wasn't the Ministry of Defense, the successor to the KGB, the FSB or the GRU or what have you. In Mali, however, Wagner is in the midst of a full-blown conflict with multiple overlapping civil wars. You have a separatist conflict in the north of the country with the Tuareg. In the center of the country, you have what is essentially an ethnic civil war masking as a jihadist insurgency with Al-Qaeda and ISIS affiliates. You have political tensions in the capital, Bamako itself. And you have Wagner with like 2,000 guys running wild in the countryside. And so with resources already constrained in Ukraine, the MOD is still trying to figure out how exactly do we hand over and rationalize and what do we want to be doing in the Sahel. So it's been a real mixed bag in terms of how this handover is going. It hasn't been clean, and there isn't, to kind of return to Prigozhin himself, to the extent that all of Wagner's different businesses kind of formed a whole, a synergistic whole. It was because they were he was the linchpin that was holding all of this together. And there's no one person anymore who can link, the gold mining executives and the political consultants and the troll farms and the mercenaries together. That was really him, figuring out ways to bring all of these very disparate kind of businesses together.
And Wagner first re-emerged publicly again in Syria in 2015 following its stint in Donbass. So what was its role there, and how did it shape the group's identity and capabilities? There's many ventures that you get into in the book.
Oh, yeah. There's a great, like the end of chapter 2 with the Battle of Hasham, I think is particularly exciting. I mean, Wagner fulfilled a different need in different places, right? And so there in Ukraine in 2014 and 2015, they were useful because they were a deniable force, right? They didn't need to be a deniable force in Syria because there was nothing covert about Russia's intervention in Syria. The MOD showed up. It was a full air campaign. Like, this was an overt intervention. And so what was Wagner's role? I mean, ultimately it became Prigozhin had to lobby to get them in, and he often had to push to get them back in after being thrown out. What the need that they fulfilled was that pretty early on, it became clear to the Russian generals that Russian air power alone would not return territory to Assad, right? And the people opposing Assad were kind of unsurprisingly much more motivated than the people fighting for Assad in turn on the ground, and without people on the ground who were willing to really go out there and try to retake this territory, you can't just do it from the air, right? As many governments have tried before. And so they needed a force on the ground, and that was what allowed Prigozhin to really get his guys in there. And they partnered with a local Syrian PMC owned by two Syrian oligarchs tied to Assad, the Jaber brothers. who are characters in and of themselves, I think, in the book. Um, and they start first in a rebel offense, in a counteroffensive against the rebels in Latakia before turning towards ISIS and capturing Palmyra. They do capture Palmyra, and the MOD says, thanks for your service. We'll take it from here. And the MOD and the Syrians lose it only a few months later in a surprise ISIS counteroffensive on Palmyra. So Wagner comes back in, and Prigozhin, to kind of create as many touch points as he can, signs a deal with the Syrian regime that they will go on the offensive against ISIS specifically, in exchange for 25% of all the proceeds from the oil and gas assets that they reconquer or take from ISIS. And so, as you remember, I mean, this is now 2017. You have the full scale operation against ISIS involving both the West and now Russia. The Kurds, backed by U.S. Special Forces and U.S. air support, are pushing from the north of Syria towards Raqqa, and the Wagner and Assad forces with Russian air backing are pushing north. The Kurds are coming south. I think I might have said it. So the Kurds are coming from the northeast south towards Raqqa, and then the Assad's forces with Wagner backing are coming from the south to the north. And I won't necessarily give away kind of the ending in the book, because I think everyone should read it. But as you can imagine, as ISIS is collapsing around this time, the territorial caliphate, and there's a retreat to their capital of Raqqa at the time, all of a sudden, all the forces start wondering what the post-ISIS world is going to look like. And so kind of as and who's going to get basically the oil and gas assets that are especially in that Syrian desert, right? And so the Kurds, they start like turning away from Raqqa and start heading towards Deir ez-Zor, and the Russians are now kind of sprinting. It's like a Mad Max like dash for for all of these assets as ISIS is collapsing, and the Kurds take the prized asset, which is the Conoco facilities right outside of Deir ez-Zor, and this puts Prigozhin in a bind because he's not getting paid by the Assad government. They're slow rolling him, and he wants that too. And I'll let the readers kind of read that section about what he decides to do.
Is there a cohesive ideology to Wagner's geopolitical moves, or are they primarily driven by the financial gain they can extract from Russian funding or local sources of income?
Yeah, I think it's both. I think it's always a great question. And I think, this is why I really wanted to make this a book that was like character driven, and it's based on interviews with about 40 guys in Wagner. And like you said, I mean, a lot more armed group people fighting against them, and civilians. It's really kind of an interview based book. And it's important because individuals, like people themselves, you and me, we're not just one thing, right? And we are motivated by multiple things at once, right? And our capacity to rationalize whatever it is that we want to do with some sort of justification as to why it's the right thing to do is basically limitless. And so and the other point too is that I'm talking to you right now from Washington D.C., right? This is a capitalist society. It is good to and it is not contradictory to be both patriotic and to make money, right? That's just that's considered inherently a good thing over here, for the most part. And so these guys thought that they were both, right? Yes, yes, they were paid. Yes, they were making money, but they should be making money because they're furthering the interests of the Russian state. And so, I would say that for the most part, and as you can imagine, there are sort of every society has these guys who do this kind of work, right? And so they do tend to lean, like, as we would say, you're conservative, in in like a U.S. political sense, and similarly in a Russian political sense. Um, the they tend to have served in the Russian military. They tend to, believe uh, in the importance of Russia, the importance of returning to Russia as a great state, and that the work that they are doing is worthy of that. Um, there are certainly plenty of members who are lean towards white nationalism, who are from different kind of Nazi groups, and go back to them and fight for them in the full scale invasion of Ukraine. Um, and then there are kind of some who are more opportunists, just there sort of for the adventure. Um, but it would be difficult to say, and there aren't really. It, I think it's difficult to find what I guess you would call like a pure mercenary, right? Someone who, if you know, if their own home country, paid them to go fight, they would go with that. But if another country paid them more to fight against their home country, that they would do that. Those people tend not to exist, and when they do, they tend to exist as like individuals, right? Not a sort of entire group. Usually these people are coming out of a military environment, a patriotic environment. They're motivated by money, but they also believe what they're doing is in their country's interest as well.
And I feel like this question, you kind of answered it indirectly throughout the past answers you were talking about. And so, to what extent did Wagner operate as an autonomous entity versus simply being a deniable extension of Kremlin policy? And this is, of course, in light of how it operated before Prigozhin was killed.
Yep. Yeah, you're right. We were kind of talking about this earlier, that the relationship between the state and Wagner was dependent upon what country they were in, whether that country was of a greater kind of national interest to the Russian state or not. And so, we talked about Ukraine. This was something that was on Russia's border. This is, clearly important existentially to the Russian state. And how do you know? Well, other Russian security institutions are there in big numbers, right? And Wagner is just one of many Russian actors who are present. The same for Syria, too, to a lesser extent than Ukraine, but the Russian Ministry of Defense itself is intervening with air assets. And so Wagner is obviously working pretty close with the Russian state in Syria. Once you get to Africa, though, this isn't as important. The Central African Republic is a good example, right? It's the poorest, least developed country in the world, unfortunately, because it's a country that I love. Russia, has a small embassy there. They don't even have like a military attaché. And so when Prigozhin shows up, he is effectively the Russian state in the Central African Republic. And he is able to expand into all sorts of businesses and things because he doesn't have that competition that he has in Syria or Eastern Ukraine. But it's a double-edged sword as well, because it means it's more difficult to kind of lobby for funding from the Russian state to fund these operations, because there's no clear interest. And so in these circumstances, and especially in Africa, Wagner is really working to create what Russia's interests in Africa should be, rather than having kind of those interests, rather than being the shadowy arm of the Russian state and fulfilling the interests of the Russian state. They're out there selling back to the Kremlin a narrative about why Russia should be in Africa, right? And why they should be receiving state support. And so it's a really interesting dynamic where it's a public-private partnership in the mix of public versus private in any given circumstances is always kind of a different weight depending on where they are.
And could you also talk a little bit about the nature of the relationship with the Sudanese regime of Omar al-Bashir pre-2019?
Yeah. That's also an interesting part in the chat. I mean, especially I think for an Egyptian, right? Because the they so I spoke with the gold mining executive, the guy who ran Wagner's gold operations in Sudan, a guy Mikhail Potyopkin. And the story he told me was that someone had approached Yevgeny Prigozhin in St. Petersburg in 2016, probably someone in like the GRU, the Russian military intelligence, and told him about this opportunity to go mine gold in Sudan and kind of in exchange provide military training to Bashir's security forces. And Prigozhin is very interested. He sends this guy Mikhail Potyopkin to go do a feasibility study. And Potyopkin goes down there and he looks at, what's being offered and who the people are. And he says, these guys are a bunch of crooks. Like, it's not going to be feasible. And Prigozhin gets mad at him and is like, he really he likes this idea of gold now. So he's like, you don't know what you're talking about. Go down there and figure it out. And so Potyopkin goes back and they figure out kind of new new relationships, and ultimately they end up facilitating a deal between Bashir and the Russian government, which is really kind of just the cover for what Wagner is going to be doing, is signing agreement for providing military training, deals on mining concessions of gold in Sudan, and that's in November of 2017. And so a contingent of Wagner instructors come into Sudan. A bunch of Russian miners go out and they start trying to work in the gold mines. And Wagner is providing training to both the Sudanese armed forces and the paramilitary rapid support forces of Hemeti at the time. It's really, funnily, it's really the UAE that introduces Prigozhin to Hemeti, looking for a way to kind of diversify and get Wagner kind of involved in Hemeti's own kind of extensive gold operations coming out of Darfur. But I mean, as you know, and by the way, too, the Wagner's political consultants are there, right? Because Prigozhin has a whole slew of things that he offers these governments, right? And so they start doing political work for Bashir. It's not very clear that political work is very valued because, I mean, who knows Sudan better than Sudan's ruler, right? He doesn't need Russians to tell him what's going on in Darfur or something like that. But they're useful to Bashir for his own reasons, because if if he wants to do something that's unpopular among kind of the ruling circle, he can say, well, the Russians have advised me that this is, what we need to do, right? So everybody's using each other. And that's what I hope people see in the book, right? Is that everybody's always using each other. Right? When the Russians are in Egypt, the Russians are trying to get things done, but the Egyptians know how to get the Russians to do things too, right? And so it's not like in Sudan, it's no different. The Central African Republic is no different. And so they're providing all of these consulting and yada yada, and then they get caught up in the Sudanese revolution, and Bashir is overthrown, and it seems like they're going to be basically out. But luckily, again, this is a testament to what Prigozhin was always trying to do. He is always looking to create as many touch points as possible, meet everybody that he can, networking, and in a way, this is how you can mitigate your risk, right? Bashir is overthrown, but he has relationships now with Burhan and Hemeti, right? And so the chances of him being able to kind of wait it out and stay in Sudan are greater, and they do manage to stay.
Indeed. And Wagner also played a role in Libya, supporting Khalifa Haftar's forces. So what was their impact on Libya's civil war, and how did their involvement fit into Russia's broader regional strategy?
Yeah. I mean, Libya was so again, like as they're trying to kind of sell these interventions also back to the Kremlin, they're also using the talking points about what is going to be geostrategically interesting, right? So in Sudan, it's Prigozhin is basically saying it's good that we're over here, right? Because we want potentially a Russian naval port in Sudan, and we're lobbying with the Bashir regime for that. Libya was always kind of interest to the Kremlin. It's on the southern flank of NATO. It's an important oil producing country, and perhaps even more importantly, Putin himself was personally offended when NATO helped overthrow Gaddafi, and it resulted in his death. And so Haftar, who had risen up as sort of the military leader of eastern Libya, is setting his sights on looking to take over the whole country. And so he rules East Libya. At the time, they're sort of kind of these independent groups. No one really rules Southern Libya, and then the GNA, if I remember correctly. I always sometimes get confused with GNA and GNU, but they're kind of a not very kind of cooperative group of militias is controlling Tripoli and Western Libya, and Haftar consolidates his power in the east, and now he wants to move to take the rest of the country, and to do so, he needs lots of men, and he needs lots of mercenaries, and so he starts recruiting. Darfur armed groups from Darfur, the Janjaweed groups that had fought against them in 2003, Chadian rebel groups as well are coming to him. He has the support of the UAE, most importantly, but also Egypt, also France, and he's increasingly lobbying for the support of the Russians. He strikes a deal with Prigozhin that Wagner is going to come in around 2018, and Wagner agrees to at least initially provide support, and so in April 2019, Haftar launches his attack on Tripoli itself, and pushes all the way to the southern suburbs of Tripoli and Ain Zara. And Wagner kind of starts playing in an increasingly kind of offensive role in it. Kind of initially they're providing logistics and some help, and then suddenly like Wagner themselves are really showing up on the front, and the support of the Russians and the UAE is starting to make a difference. And so the government of the GNU, they decide that Siraj, who's the leader at the time in Tripoli, is getting worried, and so he strikes a deal with Turkey, a memorandum of understanding on maritime borders that basically gives Turkey all of the Eastern Mediterranean, which the Egyptians weren't too happy about, if I remember. And this is important because there's a lot of potential for oil drilling in the Eastern Med. And in exchange, Erdogan sends over Turkish military advisors. They send the Bayraktar drones, and the Turks recruit thousands of mercenaries from Turkish-controlled areas of Syria. Wagner also starts recruiting Syrians to fight, and so you have this, I think, crazy section in the book where Syrians who were fighting each other in Syria are now fighting each other in Tripoli in Libya, but ultimately the Turkish intervention basically halts Haftar's progress, and eventually they're forced to retreat.
You dedicate one of the book's chapters to Wagner's diplomatic role in Central Africa. So how did Wagner build its diplomatic reputation, and why did a lot of actors trust them to break through the impasse of civil war?
Yeah. I don't think that there was like this grand plan. I mean, they showed up and the decision was made. We're going to try to do a peace deal between the government, which really only controlled Bangui, the Central African government at the time, and the major armed groups that were in the countryside. And so, I mean, a lot of the guys who were doing it were not guys who had experience in Africa. And so, but they did bring in, and a number talked to me for the book. They did bring in some guys who, would be considered Russian guys who were considered like kind of like old Africa hands, right? Who had worked in Africa before, knew a little bit more about how things worked. And basically, again, this was the ambition of Prigozhin, that they decide they're going to try to put together a peace deal. And so they start working with each of the armed group leaders to try to convince them to join a peace deal. There is some cash exchanged to also incentivize people to join the peace deal. But, at the time, the car had been going through such a devastating civil war that also a lot of people thought that this was, the time to try and get a peace deal. But and Wagner ultimately succeeded. The Sudanese were also helping because Bashir also was offering Sudanese support. Obviously, the Sudanese know the Central African Republic, quite well, especially the northern areas on their border. And so everyone comes together, and Prigozhin personally is there, really trying to push these guys into a deal in Khartoum, and they get it. Like a lot of peace deals, there's a lot on paper, and there's not, the actual progress towards integrating the armed groups into Central African armed forces, and sort of processes for reconciliation go by the wayside over time. But the Russians themselves were stunned that they pulled it off. I don't think that they didn't even expect that they were going to be successful, and this became a UN recognized peace deal. And that's one of the more, I think that section might have been like one of the more surprising ones for people in the book, was that like these guys showed up and were actually like and that's why I kind of ironically title it Diplomats. They were these different things in different places. But ultimately, as you'll see in the book, that the peace agreement doesn't last, and Wagner's mission there changes to one of a counterinsurgency.
And what does Wagner's role in Africa in general tell us about how modern mercenary groups operate in state building and governance?
Yeah, I mean, I think, uh, and I talk about this in the book. I think the uh, Wagner fits in seamlessly within kind of the African security landscape, right? There's a long history in these states, which are coming out of, horrible colonial and post-colonial circumstances of outsourcing security to outside actors who can afford to provide it, of leveraging kind of these neo-colonial relationships as well, historically with France, to enhance an African leader or the African elite's own domestic power. And so Wagner coming in as just another outside actor providing security is not, it's not incredibly different in terms of the overall structure of how these things work. What is different is that they are providing offensive operations similar to what the South Africans were doing in the 1990s, but also with like the deep pockets, the resources, and sometimes the uh, uh, state resources of Prigozhin. And so they're operating at just a very different scale. It doesn't mean that they're always effective. I mean, 2,000 mercenaries in Mali is nothing. I mean, the Central African Republic too, 1,500 to 2,000. This is a country that's the size of France, right? They can't be everywhere at all times. But nor can they change the ecosystem of these environments, right? I mean, over time, each of Wagner's operations in each African country is different, and because they have to adapt as well to the environment in which they're working in, and so they both affect the balance of power often in these conflicts, but they are also affected by the culture and the norms and the local actors on the ground as well. Uh, and so in that way they seamlessly fit in. A lot of the things that they did were not unique to Wagner, right? Signing a deal to provide security in exchange for mineral concessions. That's something that a lot of governments do, and something that a lot of PMCs would have to do that would try to replace Wagner. But I think what they did, their big legacy, is that they helped usher in multipolarity. Comes to different places, I think, at different times. And the real impact that they had was that African countries didn't have, since the Cold War, since the end of the Cold War, African countries, if they wanted to partner with an outside power to combat an insurgency or jihadism, or to make a threat about it, to get resources from the West. But I mean, really, they only had the choice of Western partners or kind of Western dominated structures, right? It was either France, the US, or basically France or the US, and maybe the British, or the United Nations peacekeeping force, right? And the arrival of Russia through Wagner provided another alternative option, and almost immediately it was fascinating to watch all the old kind of narratives that came from the Cold War about we need to contain Russian influence. What is the next domino to fall? Immediately start popping up in Western media, and it's partly a response to the fact that there is an alternative to the West, and African leaders are leveraging that, right? When they're dealing with the West, now they say, oh, make sure you give me what you want because, I'm trying to hold back the Russians right now for you, or, I'm trying, and so multipolarity, I think, has come to Africa, and the Russians helped usher it in, Prigozhin specifically. But you see now how active Turkey is becoming on the continent. You see how active the UAE and the Gulf states are on the continent. And so I think we will continue to see, and even African countries themselves are becoming incredibly active on the continent. Just look at Rwanda, for example. And so I think the space, especially for sort of these state-backed commercial kind of security enterprises, that the thing that Wagner really was a blend of, they created a market for that, and now the world is full of entrepreneurial people. And so it's sort of inevitable that there's going to be efforts to imitate it, I think.
And how does Wagner stand in operations or their political role compared to other PMCs, be they Russian or non-Russian, compared to Blackwater, for example?
Yeah, they were operating at a different scale, and like I said, they were doing something very different. Blackwater was certainly making a lot of money, and as were other contractors in the war on terror, but their mandate was largely protect this convoy of food going to the military base, or protect this important individual occupation official, U.S. occupation official in Iraq. Protect, this, building or something along those lines. And of course they would find themselves in combat, but their role was not equivalent to Wagner, which was like, go take this oil field from ISIS, right? Like that was, those are different things. And so, Wagner, I think, they had the ability to have different mandates. And I think that might be changing because the demand now probably for private structures that do that kind of work is probably increasing. And there might be more comfort with that now, even in the United States, as we've been seeing under the Trump administration.
And did Prigozhin ever really believe he could outmaneuver Putin?
I don't think he believed he could outmaneuver Putin. He thought he was outmaneuvering the Minister of Defense Shoigu. And during the mutiny, his goal was not to overthrow Putin. It was to capture and kill the Minister of Defense, which would somehow create like a fait accompli whereby like Putin would have to name him as the Minister of Defense. And so it sounds like a crazy logic, but I think he was in an environment where he thought it was either him or Shoigu. And so if he killed Shoigu, he would somehow survive. But I mean, clearly he didn't kill Shoigu, and he miscalculated on how irreplaceable he himself was.
Definitely. And there I have another Prigozhin question. So what made Prigozhin different in Putin's inner circle of businessmen and multi-men, given his background? I mean, his background was quite different to what the caliber of people within Putin's circle would look like, as I could imagine.
Yeah, I mean, I think we covered it a little bit. The difference was that Prigozhin was always an outsider trying to get in. He was an ex-convict. He was, he had been convicted. He spent 8 years in Russian prison. He's very different than sort of the very buttoned up, bureaucrats with their suits and ties, right? And he plays that to both his advantage with Putin, and it's also a disadvantage with others, right? Putin kind of likes him because he talks direct. He's willing to do anything. There's a certain fascination with that, but for others, they're just like, this guy is a total thug. Like, we don't want to hang out with him at all. And so he always had that chip on his shoulder, right? That he had to overcome his lower class status. And I mean, the other thing is that, he's one of those guys who is uh just ambitious on a different level, right? He has the mentality of, a a Silicon Valley CEO founder. It just happens to be working in like this type of business, right? He doesn't seem like he's sleeping a lot. He's always doing everything himself. He's always moving. He's always pursuing the next deal. That's where he's like thriving. Money and power, of course, are not, something he's opposed to. He likes those things, but I think it's the thrill of the transaction itself and the next thing, acquiring the next thing that is getting him up in the morning.
And you have a couple of quite harrowing stories in your book about covering Wagner. So, what were some of the challenges that you faced trying to make contacts and cover this story in general?
I mean, I got kidnapped in Mali, so that was, like that, that happened. Yeah, I traveled a lot in the Central African Republic, which, there's no, it's into places that were, controlled by armed groups. Um, I spent time with Wagner in the Central African Republic. So um, every I always try to like downplay these things, but like my wife is like, no, you got to tell them that it's actually risky, so that people don't like think that this is like not risky. It was risky, and I did everything I could to like mitigate a lot of these risks. But you're working in, I was working in Libya, Mali, Central African Republic, Syria, frontline Ukraine, and so there's a lot of conflict reporting there. Um, I rely on, I don't know, uh, stupidity, I suppose, and like a degree of, you try to mitigate your risks as much as you can. Meet people often in public, not in private. You don't go into the Wagner base to go meet people, right? But still that resulted in me getting blindfolded and spirited away in Bamako one time. Uh, but I think the thing, especially in the Central African Republic, um, where I spend a lot of time, you rely on your friends, right? That you make, and uh, you know, Central Africans, for example, are just experts in obviously their own country and society, right? And it's amazing how they are able to like, I mean, it's like that their finger is just like on the pulse, right? I'd be like, can we go here? And they'd be like, no, not today. I'd be like, how the hell do you know that? Like, and they're like, not today. We'll see in maybe a day. I'm like, what, how the hell do you know this? And I'm sure there's like secret WhatsApp going around everywhere or something like that. But like, you rely on your friends, right? And I talk about it in the book. Like those are the people who really help, an idiot guy like me go around, right? So
My next question was going to be whether you felt threatened or watched, but you just said you were kidnapped.
so yeah. Yeah, so it did happen, yeah.
But who, like, how were you released?
The Malian government. Well, I mean, it's not in the book, but my wife was actually the one who got me out because she figured out a way to hack into the phone that the Malians had, and pinged it to a cell tower, which showed where the Malian black site was, where I was being held. And then when they it got passed along to certain people, uh, who then um, who then passed it on to certain people in Mali, and then they panicked because they realized they thought that the CIA was watching them, and it was really just my wife who had figured it out, and so they like panicked and blindfolded me again and put me in a car and then like dropped me off at the hotel again. So make sure. Yeah, the other thing too is make sure you have a wife who knows what she's doing.
Yeah, kudos to her.
Yeah, for sure.
And could you maybe touch on briefly on the kind of ideological or cultural divides within Wagner itself? I mean, the very founding of it is quite.
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, like Dmitry Utkin, the number two, he's a neo-Nazi. Yevgeny Prigozhin is of, Jewish descent. That wasn't, apparently too much of an issue for those guys to come together. Um, People were across the spectrum. Some were just like normal guys who ex-military, they just this is what they like to do. This is what they're good at. And, they see it as a job. You get guys who are just like full-blown neo-Nazis, right? I don't think, at a personal level, probably not everybody gets along. But they don't have, much of a choice when they're out there. And so they find ways to, kind of make it work and avoid, the like any group, right? And I think it happens in militaries in general, right? There's like, and even on the level, it's difficult to prove, but I would think that, in terms of the human rights abuses that Wagner committed, you tend to see, uh, that the majority of human rights abuses are often committed by a minority of people, right? So there are usually, some guys in a group who kind of scare everybody else in the group and commit a lot of the kind of more heinous violence as well. You see that in armed groups and paramilitary groups, that there's different people who have a different response to the horrors of war as well.
And now that Wagner is no longer the same unified force it was under Prigozhin, do you think we'll see the rise of a new private military actor filling the same role?
No, I think we will see that the Russian state is going to be wary. There's still a need, right? The same need that existed that allowed for Prigozhin to become what he became continues to exist, right? As long as the Russian state has lofty ambitions for its role on the world stage, and as long as it's the resources to achieve that are relatively limited, there will always be an opportunity for private individuals to come in and fill the gaps. Uh, and, and so you're starting to see that too. But the Russian state after the mutiny is wary of any one person uh, gathering together all the power and resources that Prigozhin managed to do. And so instead of seeing like the next Prigozhin, I think what you're going to see are a lot of mini Prigozhins popping up in different places, and they'll and in a lot of respects they'll probably be smarter, right? Because if Prigozhin had just kind of set his ambitions more modestly, he could have continued to be a very rich man and operate within Putin's system quite effectively. And so I think the next round of people will be operating at a smaller level, probably be quieter than Prigozhin, and avoid the spotlight, but absolutely continue to do this kind of work.
And what does the Wagner model tell us about the future of warfare? Are we moving towards an era where states rely more on
I think so.
mm,
Yeah, I think so. I mean, they fit within, again, the overall trend towards the outsourcing of security, and they're operating at a level. I mean, globalization has affects everything, right? The same processes that allow you and me to get a package delivered like the next day also allow PMCs to move men and material very quickly from one conflict zone to another. I mean, there's always been mercenaries. This is not something that is new, but I think the trend towards outsourcing more and more of these types of activities to the private sector is something that will continue. I don't think this means that like the nation state is going to disappear. It's still the important referent for all of these political actors, right? Haftar is not looking to create something different than the nation state. He's just looking to take over the Libyan state and take the political reins, right? The RSF in Sudan, they are looking to just replace and take over the leadership. They're not, well, they might be calling for an independent state, but it still will be, a state in the sense of, in terms of the UN. And so I don't think that this is necessarily like resulting in the dissolution of states for corporations or anything along those lines. But the trend is towards more of these kind of outside individuals providing something that was, something that chips away at the monopoly on the legitimate use of force. And the power and the resources available to these people is growing.
All right. Any closing remarks?
No, just thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I'm a huge fan.
Of course, it's a great pleasure. And to fellow listeners, thank you for listening. And there will be links to the author's website and the link to the book, and everything is going to be in the description. Thank you very much.
Thank you.